We have heard at the end of today's symposium two very impressive views on age and aging through the arts and with an artistic approach. Now we would like to have a panel discussion and invite the panelists to talk about the future. Niels Bohr once said in a legendary statement, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with it, Niels Bohr, of course, a famous scientist of the 1920s, physicist, chemist. He talked about a theory by his colleague Heisenberg. He said any prognosis is particularly difficult if it refers to the future. And this holds true, of course, for the topic we're dealing with today. Still, we will talk about a future, the future of aging. What could it look like? And everyone knows, not only historians, if you do not look at the historic developments from the end to the beginning, but if you start at the beginning, the process is still open. It is open-ended. There are alternatives. There is not just one future into which we're headed, but there are several possible futures. I think one microphone will still be needed up here. No, we're 5 panelists. That's correct. And now I invite to the panel cultural scientist Aagje Swinnen, whom we've just heard with her last presentation, Silke van Dyk, sociologist, and her colleague Shingo Shimada from Düsseldorf, Andreas Kruse, gerontologist, and neurobiologist Thorsten Hoppe. Why don't you join me up here on the stage? Let's talk about possible futures of aging. Yes. After a whole day of sitting down, just choose a chair. Choose wherever you'd like to sit. Where I come from, usually the females sit at the outer ends, but it's not possible here. Don't worry, choose a seat wherever you like. It's perfect. Lovely, thank you. So much knowledge and expertise up here. Let me start with you, because you had the last presentation. Aagje, when you started to look into aging through the arts and aging in the arts, and this connects directly to what you've just presented to us, did it provide you with a plausible idea or maybe even a vision of a probable or highly probable future that might become a reality, a future of aging in comparison to today, a different type of aging, let's say 30 years from now, 2050. What could aging look like then? What role could it play for society and what appreciation it receives? Aging in 2050, what do you expect?
Yes. Thank you. Can everyone understand me? Yes. I've been thinking about this question, of course, in preparation of the panel. And when I started making some notes, I realized that I have to out myself as a pessimist, even though optimism is more what I would advocate in life. I showed that this preoccupation with the quest for everlasting youth is as old as humankind, but takes different forms. And I feel that today we really risk it taking very negative forms. And I don't see so much change in the future, but I would like to emphasize that this is, of course, also due to the particular context that I live and work in, which is the Netherlands. I have been reading a dystopian novel during my holiday, and it's not finished yet, by Anthony Trollope. I don't know if you know it. It's called The Fixed Period, from 1882. Has anyone read it? Has anyone read it? No. It's a novel about a so-called former British colony that has installed a law to euthanize older people that are 67 years old. And so I realized that in the Netherlands, of course, euthanasia for people who live with dementia is already possible. And there are political parties and many people who feel that this law should be extended to all older people, let's say from 65 onwards, who feel that their life is completed. Well, you have now listened to my talk. I think it's very clear that I feel that it's the so-called social circumstances that feel many older people useless, meaningless. And I think that as a society we fail to provide ways for older people to find meaning in their life, to find meaning in the later stages of their life. So I'm afraid that we might end up in very dark scenarios if we are not very careful. And we of course now live in times with the woke movements. I assume that you call them also the woke movements in Germany. But ageism is not on their agenda yet. And so I think it's a little bit of my dream that there would be much more attention for ageism, and especially everyday ageism in our society, and that we all will think about the intrinsic worth of every life stage.
Danke, Aagje. Ich knüpfe da mal an, weil die Inhalte...
Thank you, Aagje. I'll connect right to it, because the touching points are obvious to all of us, I think. Professor van Dyk, in your presentation, you talked about more, and you said it clearly, not only between the lines, that looking at the current ideas and notions and perceptions of age and aging by society and by politicians, what hides behind is oftentimes a neoliberal narrative connected to the fact that this phase of aging needs to be, I don't know, processed in such a way that society can deal with it. And it connects to this dystopian vision in a way. So either you're worth something for society or out you go, off you go. Is that do you share this dystopian view? Or based on your own work and based by the input by all of these people, are you utterly optimistic that in the next 30 years we'll manage to change? That would be nice. No, I think in a way I share your pessimism. And of course, yes, it's this question of economics of life, if you will, or how much are you worth for society? And this discussion about euthanasia, for example, of course, does have a major influence on this discussion about old age. The situation, I know, in the Netherlands is different to Germany, but the German Federal Court also issued a judgment, which I see very critical, because I think this pressure to be worth something and to look at the costs of aging, the costs society has to bear, is something that is being discussed. Recently, I read in a newspaper a statement that, of course, nobody must be pushed to voluntarily take a leave and go and end their life, but that it is an individual decision. And if an older lady would decide in favor of dying to enable her grandchild to go to university, that it was connected in the article. And I think that was a start for the German discussion to start to talk about this, about assisted suicide. One thing which might be a bit more optimistic, I can say that in this social debate, we're looking at inequalities, social classes. They have now come back to science and research and to the political debate as well. I think we'll have to wait and see what this turns into. And the current people who are running for election and the political parties who are running for election in September, they don't focus so much on that yet. But in the past, we had discrimination and anti-discrimination in previous elections, electoral run-ups, and I think it might come back, and it might focus on aging as well. But it shows that this topic is not really discussed in the German-speaking countries. For any type of discrimination, we talk about it. Why do we never talk about discrimination of old age? And people come back to me and say, but that is different somehow, because it has a real foundation, they tell me. And that simply shows how dramatic it is and what a taboo it still is in society. But I do have a little bit of optimism because this question of status and class is being discussed more and more. But politicians who talk about redistribution of wealth, welfare state, and secured retirement pensions, if we don't focus on that more, then in 2050 we will have an even higher categorization or division between the haves and the have-nots in 2050. There will be a substantive minority who will be able to compensate for the lack of welfare state benefits with their own wealth, but then we will have the majority of society who are the have-nots, who don't have enough financial means. So the lower 50% do not have the financial resources to compensate for what the state is not providing them with. Poverty in old age is especially prevalent and will be among women in particular. And one more thing, then I'll stop. One more thing. We still have a pension system in Germany that imagines a retired person who has worked for a number of years. But women never did that. And in addition, we have more and more men who went through phases where they worked part-time or in precarious jobs. So this imagined retired person who has worked for 40 years in the same company, etc., it doesn't exist. It's not empiric reality. And if we don't change that, the division will be even greater. Right, thank you. Do pass on your microphones to the next speaker, if you will. Thank you. Mr. Shimada, you have been observing these phenomena and processes and discussions about and within aging societies with two different backgrounds. You said, I don't really want to talk about the cultural differences, but of course you do have these cultural backgrounds. So what you've perceived, the developments in Germany and in Japan, what will it look like in 2050? Is there a difference? Look 30 years into the future. It's just the bat of an eye, really. It's nothing. 30 years ago, the wall came down. Some of us will still remember how fast time has passed since then. So 30 years from now, how do you perceive these two societies? In particular, against the background of what you said, that in the 70s in Japan, you were the youngest of all industrial countries, and 25 years later, you were the oldest society of all the industrial countries. That might be a psychological problem too for the society, don't you think? Well, with a view to the future, let me put in another thought here, and this is urban areas. We haven't talked about urban areas yet. The gap in age between urban and rural areas, that is another thing. We haven't talked about rural areas so much yet. Of course, in the villages, the 60 to 70% of people might be 65 years of age or older. And if you know the Japanese landscape or countryside, you will be able to imagine that many villages in rural areas are hard to reach. And there, the aging processes are even more extreme. And the discrimination of old people with a view to rural areas is even more extreme because social politics says clearly there are villages which are not fit for survival. Politicians clearly say we will not care for them anymore. They will not receive any help. They will, cease to exist. And the villages will die with the last of their inhabitants. They will vanish. That is the tendency, maybe you're familiar with that too, rural areas that simply die out. But in Japan, for example, I know a number of villages where in the mountains that have really vanished from the map because all of their inhabitants died and nobody came after them. It's also a political strategy, and I think that is a major problem. So you're directly connecting to the dystopian vision of Mrs. Swinnen here. And that is not very encouraging, what you're saying here. So Andreas Kruse, maybe you can come in with a bit more optimism. Let's look at this psychological idea, this in a twofold view. Time moves swiftly and quickly, and time moves very slowly at the same time. There is this statement, inside every old person, there's a young person wondering what happened. I believe every one of us is familiar with this feeling, at least. Regardless of what age you are, at some point in time you stop and think, whatever you see when you look in the mirror, is this person similar in their dreams and everything to the person you were at 19, at 24, at 32, etc.? And this outward appearance and your character, your intrinsic character, to what extent does it overlap? Now, when you think about 2050, and when you, Mr. Kruse, look back to the past 30 years, where you have been very active and very influential in this area, how do you see the future? How do you see age and aging in our society 30 years down the road? Well, maybe allow me to raise one issue that might interrupt your train of thought. But one thing that's deterministic of the environment or framework conditions, that is climate change, or the climate crisis, rather. The climate crisis will hit, first and foremost, old people of the lower social strata. They will be the first ones to be hit, to suffer from the effects of the climate change. Their health will suffer in ways unimaginable to us today. Secondly, the climate change will bring about social distortions that we can't even imagine nowadays, and then social inequalities will become so prevalent that they cannot be ignored anymore. People will say, how can I move away from regions? How can I escape from regions of extreme heat that are in stark contrast to what our organism needs? The cardiovascular system, especially of old people, cannot deal with that. So old people might then say, I will flee from these areas. Other people might not be able to flee, so what will happen? And then, of course, yes, we might continue to talk about the state and the state being able to alleviate the repercussions of climate change, etc. There will be effects that might be compensated by investing a lot of money, but others will not be able to insure themselves against this. And that will create social gaps unimaginable to us today. For me, it does not only mean that we need to change politics at its core. One of the candidates said, I will not change my politics just because of this one report that was issued a few weeks ago, but that is the naivete of today. You have to change that attitude, but you also have to change politics in such a way that this deep-rooted social inequality is always in focus. Inequality in our country itself, and also the deep-rooted social inequality in the world. And here I think we have to be in awe of life, like Albert Schweitzer said. Each and every life, he said, is entitled to be respected, regardless of where they live, where they are. So for me, that is the strictest of all principles. Every life has to be respected. And the second train of thought here, aging, I thought it was quite stark, the statement that I heard before. If we do not succeed to tap into this spiritual dimension or this dimension of attitude towards age and aging, if we fail to appreciate it and to put it into focus, if we fail to do that, well, then age and aging will only be regarded with an economic lens. This statement here, this portrait of dance and dancers, that is a presentation you should take out into the world and make visible what we perceived there, self-actualization, people with dementia, how they dance. It's a boost for their own self. And at the same time, you witness a very old idea of philosophy, which is the spirit which is not just anchored in your brain. Aristotle said the spirit extends, flows across your whole body and is visible and feasible in all of our actions. If you look at a human being and their actions, the spirit is not just the solution to a problem, but the spirit, your attitude, your mindset rather, maybe it's that, your mindset needs continuity. When we look at people with dementia, there are continuity issues, biographical memories, for example. They know, they recognize where they are and they react in a way they did before, and that's the rebooting of yourself. If we were to focus and strengthen such a model, then we would respect human beings with all their vulnerabilities much more. And secondly, we would provide such a strong impulse impulse to these people to recognize what is at the core of life. If we don't do that, age and aging will be regarded through the economic lens, and that's that. I think it's important how we speak about and deal with life and death. And one last thought, this the process of dying, Plutine, Roman philosopher, said, dying is the culmination of life, because in dying we recognize our life, we see how we live. So this change in a mindset is necessary. How we see life, how we see death and dying. And I see a big exclamation mark there. Our society needs to step it up there and deal with it much more. But climate change, the climate catastrophe, that is something I'm worried about. When I look at my grandchildren, I think, damn, what's the kind of world we're leaving to you? Damn it. Do not underestimate that. It's not a matter of 15 or 20 years, it's a matter of 5 or 6 years only, unfortunately.
All right, so we pick up this thought, and now we will ask Thorsten Hoppe a twofold question. Or maybe two questions, one behind the other. And before I ask you for your idea of age in 2050, I would like to know before, how do these topics that we have just briefly discussed in these 4 statements, how do they, or how are they reflected in your excellence cluster? You're not just a bunch of 400 scientists, natural scientists, looking at naked mole rats all day long and worms, but you also deal with all of these questions as well. So against the backdrop of your daily work, how is this reflected? How do you discuss that? Do you confront it? Or maybe like Edward Teller, do you just say, well, I just built a bomb, what happens with it, I don't care? Well, I talked to this with my colleague earlier, These are topics that we don't deal with in everyday life. And what I showed you in my presentation was just briefly to explain to you what we actually do. So they are molecular processes that take place within the cells. And then the big picture is influenced. But until that happens, it's still a long way down. Gene manipulation would help us to stay younger for longer, but we're not that far as that we could just put that into pills and then we can all be happy to stay young forever. But there are always discussions whenever we participate in conferences on these topics. And of course, psychological factors come into play. They can also have an influence on our organism and neuronal processes, of course. However, in our everyday life or business, we pretty much focus on the original processes of life. That's what we are experts in. And I am convinced that what I just showed you hasn't changed since the 1990s, but we have learned a lot. We know that aging can be influenced. And what also came about from our discussions, which became quite negative, those discussions have existed when people were considered old at the age of 60 or 65. And old people were just outcast because the families didn't have anything to share with these old people other than just feeding them through until the end of their lives. So maybe it's just a shift of our average life age. Now, the elderly are much more agile. If I compare that to my grandparents, when they were 70, 75, I saw the dent on the sofa. I could remember that. So they didn't move much anymore. They didn't travel at the time. So maybe there's a shift of old age in the timeline. Maybe we are younger in old age now, and maybe we can actually enable people to take part in life and the economic process much longer. So this brings into play social aspects, economic aspects, the appreciation of old age, and actually this is something that we should all aspire for. You know, now when you're young, you point to the old, but once you're old, you are the one being pointed to. Right. After this first round, we discussed that after the presentations and the introductions, we could just play ping pong a little and discuss amongst ourselves. But I can see a divide between you, that you are quite agile, quite motivated, have an international expertise, a huge team. Of course, everything could be better, but you have an excellence cluster, which is very well equipped. And you can help avoid the aging process or extend it. And I call this a neoliberal narrative, so you can benefit from your lifespan as long as possible, and you actually work against that. Now I ask the other scientists on stage, on the panel. Let me start with you, Ms. van Dyk. Aren't you worried? Nope. No, we've got other things to worry about. I don't share your opinion. I don't think that this is a research that works within the sense of neoliberalization of age. As far as I understand, it's not really about extending life, but extending a healthy life. And I think a society that has the best opportunities for good health is not a social imperative. The question is, what does it bring about, and why do you want that? Is that so as to save money and to exploit the old people as another resource? But I think this is a huge gain in our civilization to be healthy much longer in life. And sometimes, of course, as a sociologist, I would stop and think about the individual opportunities. They are quite high in prevention. But of course, there is a social gap. Nevertheless, the question is always what can be gained health-wise in society? And maybe one more thing, because this is a topic that is very important for our society. What is a healthy society? Is health an imperative? Or let's just differentiate. It's very important to have a society with the best opportunities for health. But if you want to live a short and excessive life, you say, well, I don't want to be old, I just want to have a good life, then go ahead. Health should not be an imperative. This is a huge difference. Not a healthy society as a dictum, but the opportunities for health in life and in old age. Aagje Swinnen, I would like to directly ask you for your opinion. Now, the representation of age and aging and also morbidity in artistic works, in artistic projects, means that art is dealing transience and transitoriness much differently than before. Now it's idealization. It's not about idealization anymore, but it deals now with the processes of age and aging. But on the other hand, we heard of an orientation towards more and more healthy life in old age. But are these tendencies that you can also see reflected in art? Has that already entered the field of art? Ms. van Dyk says it's not neoliberal, but it's a healthy imperative in art.
Well, I think that the most art on aging that I have encountered provides more of a counter-narrative. And that's of course also why I'm interested in it. I also look specifically for those that I feel confront us with a certain reality that we would like maybe to question and to rethink. Then in terms of this healthy imperative, while we are talking, I'm thinking of my students who are actually also suffering a lot, young students who are suffering a lot of this imperative, because this successful aging paradigm, it really is like tripling down to all layers of the population, in the sense that this whole idea that you are in charge and responsible for your own well-being is so massive that many young people also suffer from mental health issues. And I think this really connects to what Professor Kruse said about the spiritual. I feel that if we do not talk about the vulnerabilities that are characteristic for our lives across the lifespan, and I'm not only talking about physically but also emotionally, socially, right? Think of broken relationships, etc., broken friendships that also younger people deal with, the burden of having to look a certain way. A lot of young people suffer from diseases like anorexia, things like that. We have never had as many psychologists for students as we have now, and it's never enough. So I think really that it's the problem is bigger than that. It really has to do with our late modernity and this whole idea that we constantly have to be so narcissistic that we have to look at ourselves, improve ourselves rather than to be, and just to accept that we can all be different in good ways. Yeah.
Ich gebe die Frage mal weiter.
I will pass that question to Mr. Kruse, and I would add something to it. Mr. Kruse, now I would like to point that out. For more than 3 decades, you've been working in politics advice. Now, the scenarios that Mr. Hoppe has described, what happened in the past 25 years in this field of research, and what kind of progress we will make in the next 25 to 30 years. I don't really agree with Ms. van Dyk's optimism yet. And you are thinking about politics and how politics has reacted to such developments in the past. So people can be productive for much longer for the economy and for the society. So is there a threat that political forces and bureaucracy or insurance companies might say, that's a cool thing? So they will have much more quality of life in old age and not really help the economy? Or do you think that there could be some threats as well? Well, first of all, I would like to say one thing to the presentation of Mr. Hoppe and to Mr. Hoppe himself. When something like that is presented the way he did, you had respect for life. You showed the problematics, and I agree with Ms. van Dyk. What can we do in order to make accessible to all people and to make it possible for them to have a share in health? So the concept is very good to deal with that topic. So what is the overall mechanism in order to avoid such diseases? I think that's a great thing. But if, and here again I agree with you, if you put that together with a holistic understanding of health, so let's say if we were to say, in how far will people be able to deal with the huge challenges of the world in a better way? It's an important political question. And if they then, if you just succeed in telling the policymakers, well, when it's about enabling people not to be self-determined and responsible, but also to be responsible for others and show respect towards the creation and the world, to have a more holistic understanding of health, bodily health, physical health, emotional and spiritual health, then you can make a change. So you do need to explain this to a political decision maker. Of course, they know about it, but to visualize that. What are the challenges in the future? Migration, for example, climate change, social gaps. And if you tell them, listen, it cannot be enough to just understand a functioning organism, a functioning cognition, free from dementia, so that people can produce, but you do not have a holistic understanding of health, where you need to keep into mind the spiritual health, the emotional health, and that people will be able to deal with huge challenges responsibly. If you put that in such a context, then you might have a chance. So you have to sensitize them. And secondly, and here again I agree with Ms. van Dyk, you need to understand the following. Social developments can be linked to huge challenges, so that political decision makers cannot actually tackle these challenges. And then it could happen that you have very simple solutions. So, for example, you have a demographic change. The simple solution would be, retirement age needs to be increased. That would be a simple solution, but in my view, then political decision makers need to make sure to see the long-term effects and the long-term developments in order to understand those. So it's not just a simple solution that we need. It's not the answer to that question, but speaking of Mr. Hoppe's presentation, if somebody is in the German Bundestag and presents an ethically and empirically responsibly solution, they should start thinking about these developments today, even if they have to make a decision later on. But we have to deal with that in advance. Dementia, for example, or multimorbidity in old age will be very important to our society in the future. So, please, support prevention, support the research in that direction. So you can only appeal to them, think ahead, because we are living in a world, compared to 30 years ago, where certain huge social challenges are ahead of us. And here you have to think ahead. And you have to hope that political decision makers are more sensitized to that. One topic, they are much more sensitive now. How do I deal with people with dementia? Because whenever I talk to politicians, I hear, well, my mother has dementia as well, or my aunt has with dementia. How do I deal with people dying? I have that at home. How do I deal with the care for my family members? Everybody can relate now because they have a personal experience in their family. And I can tell you the care insurance, Ms. van Dyk has alluded to it, without the personal experiences of the former family minister, Ms. Süßmuth, and the former Labour minister, Mr. Bloom, without their experiences, because very often I can remember these talks, they say, oh, what is it like at home, and what is it like in my family? Without their personal experiences, we would not have had this care insurance system. And, you know, that's what helped. But Mr. Kruse, you have actually avoided my question very elegantly. According to your experience with political decision makers, do you think that the responsible approach is possible now? Yes or no? Well, let's say it again. It depends on how we address these topics. Please believe me. How do we address them? I'm not very pessimistic. I do understand this topic is a very ambivalent topic because it's so complex. So these are different interests, different paradoxes, and different social and economic demands. Mr. Shimada, do you agree with this slightly optimistic prognosis, or would you say, after what you have seen in Japanese society, that this is really just a fragment of time, what you've experienced? Are our political systems, due to the dynamics of a democracy, skilled to react to this development? Well, yes and no. Okay, so that was an ambivalent question, and now I get an ambivalent answer. Well, I do have a certain trust in institutional care. Yes, I do. But on the other hand, so far we haven't talked about one topic the lack of nurses and care staff, which is a huge topic that can be tackled by politics and politicians, but we haven't talked about that. But at the international level, all of Asia is aging now as well. And those are the origin countries of foreign nurses. So they are getting older as well. So I expect at international level, actually it's already happening, that there will be a struggle for nurses and care staff. And I don't know what the solution to that will be and what will happen. And then again, we also have labor migration and the necessity of labor migration. Because sometimes, you welcome that, to have nurses in these countries, but the nursing situation in their places of origin will be problematic now. So what happens then? We don't know. And I think that's very difficult to give a prognosis, but there will be an international conflict. I find that pretty probable. And so far, we have done only few at political level. Let me just ask one more question, because we are now talking about two nations, Germany and Japan. What you haven't said yet, and what I would be interested in, is that at meta level, what is the difference in discourse? Is this topic dealt with in Japan in a different way compared to Germany? Or are the negotiations and mechanisms the same? Well, when it comes to the discourse, there are differences, definitely. At Japanese side, in social policy, they discuss it at a much more pragmatic level. And I've only just hinted to it today. So major concepts, social values, social equality, solidarity, the human dignity and things like that. Do these values play a much less important role than here? What that means at political level, I can't tell you. But I think the Japanese political planning is much more pragmatic and more short-sighted, not far-sighted. But before I end this round, I would like to ask a question to Mr. Hoppe, which will probably lead to a much more complex scenario. Mr. Hoppe, in many natural scientist environments, we hear of information technology, and here they are working on the singularity moment, so that technology will one day be at the same level as humans with artificial intelligence. Such forecasts are difficult because they deal with the future. Nevertheless, in your excellence cluster, you are also making some prognosis, if you will. Now, do you think, as a natural scientist, in a technical discipline, medical discipline, biological discipline, when do you think will you be ready to do genetic interventions? Does that mean to manipulate people genetically? You talked about the worms and the naked mole rats, and you've done genetic modifications there. But when do you think can we do that with humans? And you said, well, we're not allowed to do experiments with humans, but now we know lots of things will be possible in the future and or will be done in the future. And of course, we are all tempted if we know that it is possible. Whoever will do the first step. You know, my question is, when do you think will the science sector be ready to know where we have to make an amendment? Well, we do have the know-how. We know that we can amend genes. You know, you have the gene scissors. You probably know about them in microbiology or molecular biology. So we could do that with mice. But it's an ethical question. At least in Germany, this is not allowed. This is not possible. This will not take place to experiment on humans. And of course, when it comes to nuclear physics, everything that is doable will be done. It depends on the different nations and regulations. Of course, the findings that we have could be used theoretically. And we could say, okay, I could manipulate a gene, and then you will be living 20 years longer, and you can decide for yourself. However, these are scenarios that I do not want to think about. I think we as a society need to deal with it and discuss this. I'm asking you this because we have made the experience that there are countries who do not really care about ethics, and they do have the technical means to do so, and then they might have a much longer lifespan in their countries. Let me put it this way. So I'm quite realistic that this will happen. And now, at the end of the day, I would like to give you the opportunity, you, the audience, to ask questions, to make a comment, to say everything you said is a lie, or you say, oh, you did a great job, anything you like. The floor is yours.
Or are you tired and want to go home? You need some oxygen?
Es ist 19 Uhr und 25.
It is 5 minutes, it's 7:25. And I would like to thank you, all of you, for this highly fascinating day, for your presentations. Such a day full of input, full of information, a density of information, looking at questions that range across such a number of topics. I told my family where I would be today, and last week we had a birthday, 4 generations around a table. And I told them that this would be the event I would be moderating this year. And 4 generations discussed this hotly, debated it, argued this question of should we prolong health and a healthy lifespan beyond what is allowed to what is possible. We discussed this a long, long time. Right. Thank you very much. That was the final panel of this symposium, Aging and the Society, within the context of aging of the Typhoon Plus project. First and foremost, I would like to thank the experts, the speakers of today. Thank you for helping us look for questions and not for answers.
Nicht nur die Psychologen in der Runde.
Not only the psychologists of today's panel deserve the applause, the internet applauded us as well. Thank you to the venue, Palais Wittgenstein. Thank you to the technicians and the interpreters. Thank you for listening. Nadine Hickmans and Andrea Wilming say goodbye from the booth. We have to mention their names at the end of the day. Thank you for the technicians, as I said. Thank you to the audience and the audience in front of their screens, back home, from your mobile phones, your laptops, wherever you logged into this symposium. Liko Fang, Mark Franz, thank you very much for this project. Plus project, Aging World, and thank you for today's event.
Und das möchte ich am Rande noch
And last but not least, let me mention that Mr. Iriyama, the Consul General, he was here half the day, but the Ministry for Culture is represented here by Katrin Boss, who's one of the sponsors, and on Monday morning she will probably tell the Minister of the Federal State what we've discussed here today. Thank you for having attended. Mark Franz and Liko Fang, yes, of course. A big hand for you. Not everywhere it goes without saying that someone from the ministry attends and stays until the end. I haven't seen that much in publicly funded events. Liko and Mark will now have the final words and will tell you how this project will continue in the spring of 2022. And then you will be accompanied into this beautiful summer evening. My name is Peter Grabowski. Thank you very much for your attention today and for the vivid discussions of today. Thank you.